The kitchen fell silent the moment the handcuffs closed around his wrists. Every knife stopped moving. Every burner kept hissing, forgotten, steam curling upward into a room that had gone still as glass. Marcus Bellamy stood with his back straight, his chef's apron still tied at his waist, while two officers read him rites he had once recited to other men, in another life, under another name. Vivian Kessler stood at the doorway and did not blink. "Get him out of my house," she said, and turned away before he could speak. He did not try. His eyes, calm as still water, told a story none of them were ready to read yet. No one in that kitchen understood that the man they had just dragged out in handcuffs was the only person standing between the Kessler empire and the collapse that was already coming for it. What do you think really happened to those diamonds? Savannah mornings arrived slow and golden, the kind of light that made even a modest kitchen look like a painting hung crooked on purpose. The kind of light that asked nothing of anyone and gave generously anyway. Marcus Bellamy woke before sunrise, the way he always had, the way the job had trained into him long before he ever picked up a knife for a living. He moved through the small house on Bull Street, with the quiet efficiency of a man who had once counted seconds for a living, back when seconds mattered more than most people ever had reason to understand, back when a delay of 10 seconds could mean the difference between a clean operation and a funeral. Eggs cracked one-handed, coffee brewing without a wasted motion, the kettle timed to the minute out of habit rather than necessity, the whole kitchen a small, contained ritual he had built for himself out of the wreckage of another life. Upstairs, his daughter Ava, 8 years old, slept with one arm thrown over a stuffed rabbit, unaware that her father's hands, so steady with a whisk, had once held far more dangerous things, had once made decisions that carried weight far beyond breakfast. By 7 he had her fed, her backpack checked twice, her shoelaces double-knotted the way she liked them, tight enough that she never had to think about them again for the rest of the day, loose enough that she never complained. He drove her to Oglethorpe Elementary himself every morning. No matter how early his shift began at the Kessler estate, no matter how many times his supervisor suggested he leave earlier, and let the housekeeper's daughter drive her instead, it was the 1 hour of the day that belonged entirely to him. Untouched by the world he moved through for the rest of it, and he guarded it the way other men guarded fortunes, refusing every offer to trade it away for convenience. At the Kessler mansion, Marcus was simply the private chef, competent, punctual, forgettable, if anyone bothered to look twice, which mostly they did not, because there was nothing about him that invited a second glance, and that, too, was by design, a design he had spent years perfecting long before Savannah ever entered his life. The household staff treated him the way people treat furniture that works well, useful, present, unexamined, easy to walk past without a second glance, on the way to somewhere more important. He was handed tasks outside his role without complaint, covering for the wine steward when he called in sick, hauling equipment for events that were not his responsibility, standing in for the events coordinator during last-minute crises no one else wanted to solve, absorbing the extra weight without ever once mentioning it to anyone, including himself. He never argued. He never explained himself. There was a discipline to his silence that no one recognized for what it was, mistaking restraint for meekness, mistaking patience for a lack of ambition, the same mistake people had been making about quiet men for as long as quiet men had existed. What they did not see was the way his eyes moved across the security cameras mounted above the kitchen doorway, not with curiosity, but with the practiced calculation of a man reading a system rather than admiring a room. He noted blind spots without meaning to, the way another person might notice a crooked picture frame and feel a small itch to straighten it. He clocked the guard's rotation schedule the way another man might hum a tune under his breath, absent-mindedly, out of habit rather than intention, filing the pattern away without ever deciding to. Old instincts did not retire even when the man carrying them had, and some mornings, standing at the stove with eggs sizzling in front of him, some small part of his mind was still running perimeter checks on a building he had no professional reason to secure, a reflex older than his daughter, older than the apron, older than the name Bellamy itself in some ways. The Kessler estate ran like its own small kingdom, and Vivian Kessler ruled it with a composure that unsettled people twice her age. At 33, she had inherited Kessler and Vance, the jewelry house her grandfather built from a single storefront into an international name, recognized from Fifth Avenue to Paris, and she had spent a decade proving that inheritance was not the same as ownership, that a name on a building meant nothing if the person behind it had not earned the right to stand beneath it. She read every contract herself before signing it, no matter how late the hour or how routine the deal appeared on paper. She sat through every design review personally, no matter how minor, correcting settings and clasps with an eye trained since childhood at her grandfather's workbench. She had earned the empire twice over, in the eyes of everyone who worked beneath her, and she carried that fact the way some people carry a title, quietly, without needing to announce it, letting the results speak in her place. The estate was preparing for the auction of the century, the unveiling of a $4 million diamond collection that would anchor Kessler and Vance's new era of prestige, a collection Vivian herself had spent 18 months sourcing, authenticating, and insuring against every conceivable risk, except the one that mattered most. Every hallway buzzed with preparation. Security had been tripled for the week. Extra guards posted at every entrance, credentials checked twice at every threshold. Insurance appraisers came and went in dark suits, clipboards in hand, murmuring numbers to one another that made even seasoned staff nervous to be in the same room as the vault, numbers large enough to bend the air around them. Vivian walked the halls each morning with a checklist longer than her patience, and nothing escaped her notice, or so she believed, right up until the moment that belief was proven catastrophically wrong. Beside her, always a step behind and a shade too close, stood Preston Vaughn, the estate's head of security and her late father's most trusted advisor, a man who had been part of the household longer than Vivian herself had been alive, who had taught her to ride a bicycle in the very garden the auction guests would soon be walking through. He murmured concerns to her in low, careful tones during their morning walkthroughs: internal risk, unfamiliar staff, the dangers of trusting people whose backgrounds had not been properly vetted by anyone he considered thorough enough for a house holding this much wealth. He never named Marcus directly. He did not need to. The implication settled into the air like smoke, quiet enough to go unnoticed, deliberate enough to do its work slowly, over weeks, until Vivian's own instincts had been quietly rewired without her ever realizing the hand that had done the rewiring. What Vivian did not see, because she had no reason to look, was Preston slipping into the Diamond Vault's antechamber late one evening, alone, checking the storage locks with a thoroughness that had nothing to do with security and everything to do with opportunity, his flashlight tracing the same seams in the wall he had traced a dozen times before, memorizing angles no ordinary guard would ever need to know, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had already decided how this would end. The night of the final rehearsal before the auction, the estate glittered with candlelight and tension in equal measure. Caterers moved through the halls balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres, careful not to brush against the velvet ropes already strung along the gallery walls. String music drifted from the ballroom, rehearsed a final time for acoustics, swelling and fading beneath the chandeliers. Marcus worked the kitchen line with two assistants, plating dishes for the small circle of investors and appraisers invited to preview the collection before the public event. His movements as unhurried and precise as they always were, whether he was feeding a family of two or a room full of millionaires. And somewhere between the second course and the dessert service, the diamonds vanished from the vault. The discovery came fast and brutal, a guard's shout echoing down the marble corridor, sharp enough to cut through string music 2 rooms away. A door found unlocked that should never have been unlocked, its keypad still glowing green as though nothing at all had happened. The security footage from the vault corridor, the one stretch of camera that should have captured everything, had gone dark for exactly the 11 minutes. The theft required the very same 11 minutes Marcus had been delivering a tray of food to a private dining room down that same hallway, a route he had walked 100 times without incident, a route that suddenly, in the space of one evening, became the only detail anyone in the house cared to remember about him. Vivian arrived at the scene with her jaw set and her voice already sharpening into something cold and fast, her heels striking the marble floor hard enough to echo. She did not ask questions first. She looked at the guest list, the staff roster, the footage gap, and landed, with terrible speed, on the one name that made the least sense to her and the most sense to Preston, who stood just behind her shoulder, saying nothing, letting the silence do what accusation could not do on its own, in a silence he had built for exactly this moment. In front of caterers, guests, and half the household staff, Vivian turned on Marcus with a fury that had clearly been building long before that night, though she would not have been able to say from where. She called him careless. She called him beneath the trust the family had extended him. She said words about background and worth that had nothing to do with diamonds and everything to do with the assumptions she had carried about him since the day he was hired, assumptions built on the shape of his job rather than the substance of the man doing it, assumptions she had never once bothered to question. The police were already being called before she finished speaking, her voice carrying down the hallway loud enough that guests 2 rooms away fell quiet to listen, phones already lifting to record what would become tomorrow's headline. Marcus did not defend himself. He did not raise his voice, did not plead, did not so much as flinch at the cruelty in her tone. He simply looked at her, steady and unreadable. And for one strange second, something in that stillness made Vivian falter mid-sentence. Though she would not have been able to say why, a hesitation so brief that only he seemed to notice it. She pushed the feeling away as quickly as it came, unwilling to examine it under the weight of everything else collapsing around her in that moment, and finished what she had started. The interrogation room at the Chatham County precinct was small, fluorescent, and indifferent to the storm outside it. 4 gray walls and a table bolted to the floor. A young detective sat across from Marcus with a legal pad and a set of questions he had asked 100 other suspects. Questions built for men who panicked, who over-explained, who filled silences with lies. They could not keep straight for more than 10 minutes. He was not prepared for the answers he got back instead. Marcus spoke about chain of custody, about the specific vulnerabilities of a camera system that failed only in one precise corridor for one precise window of time, about how professional theft rarely looked like theft at all. It looked like maintenance, like routine, like nothing worth a second glance from anyone not specifically trained to notice it, and even then, only if they knew exactly where to look. The detective's pen slowed, then stopped altogether, hovering above the legal pad. He asked, almost involuntarily, where a chef had picked up language like that. Marcus only said that he had worked adjacent to security systems before, years ago, and left it there, flat and closed, like a door he had no intention of opening further that night, no matter how many times the detective tried the handle. Vivian, standing just beyond the 2-way glass at Preston's suggestion, heard every word. She had come expecting to watch a guilty man stumble, to see the cracks she needed to see in order to feel certain about the decision already forming in her chest. Instead, she watched a man speak with a precision that unsettled her more than any confession could have. A precision that did not match anything in the personnel file sitting on her desk, a file that listed nothing more exotic than culinary school, and a string of unremarkable references. For the first time since the diamonds disappeared, a small, unwelcome doubt took root beneath her certainty, thin and quiet, but undeniably there, refusing to be dismissed no matter how firmly she tried. She thought back, almost against her will, to small things she had never once considered worth noticing: the way he always positioned himself with a clear line of sight to every doorway in a room, the way he never once turned his back fully to an open window, the way his hands, even at rest, seemed to be counting something only he could see. None of it had meant anything to her a month ago. All of it meant something now, and she did not yet know what to do with the meaning. She said nothing about it to Preston. She simply watched Marcus a little longer than she needed to, filing away details she could not yet explain, the way one files away a sound in an empty house that might have been nothing, or might have been something worth remembering later when the noise of everything else had finally quieted down enough to think clearly. Back near the observation room's file cart, unattended for a matter of seconds while an officer stepped out to take a call, Marcus's eyes caught something on an open security log and access code for the vault corridor, changed at 11:40 that same night, hours before the theft, by a credential that did not belong to any of the standard rotation staff listed anywhere in the file. He said nothing. He simply remembered it, the way he remembered everything that mattered, filed away behind a face that gave nothing back to anyone watching. A face that had learned long ago the value of appearing to forget. The story broke by morning, splashed across local news before the sun had fully cleared the harbor. then picked up by outlets far beyond Savannah by noon. Kessler and Vance's stock dropped before the markets had even fully opened, headlines calling the theft an inside job. Reporters camped outside the estate gates by noon, cameras trained on every car that came or went, microphones thrust toward anyone who so much as slowed near the gate. The board convened an emergency call, demanding answers Vivian did not yet have, and a resolution she could not yet deliver with any real confidence, voices overlapping on the line until she could barely track who was speaking. Every hour that passed without an arrest chipped away at the company's carefully built reputation, and with it, her father's legacy, which she had sworn to protect above all else, even at the cost of her own certainty, even at the cost of things she would only understand the value of later. Under that pressure, Vivian made the call to push forward with formal charges against Marcus, publicly, decisively, before the board could question her control of the situation any further. It was the fastest path to calm the markets. It was also, some quiet part of her recognized even as she signed the paperwork, not something she felt entirely settled about, a discomfort she buried beneath the weight of everything the company needed from her in that moment, telling herself there would be time later to examine the feeling properly. That same week, at Oglethorpe Elementary, Ava sat alone at lunch while two boys at the next table whispered loud enough to be heard, asking if her daddy was really a thief, if he was going to jail, if that was why she looked so sad all the time lately, their voices carrying that particular cruelty children have before they learn to hide it. She did not cry in front of them. She waited until she was in the car, seatbelt buckled, before the tears came, and asked her father in a small, cracked voice whether it was true, whether any of it could possibly be true. Marcus pulled the car over onto a quiet side street lined with live oaks. He knelt beside her window, took her small hands in his, and told her the only thing he knew for certain, that he had never taken anything that was not his, and that no matter what anyone said, that would not change, not now, not ever, not for headlines or handcuffs or anything else the world decided to throw at either of them. It was the first time in years anyone had seen him let his composure slip, even slightly, even for a moment meant only for his daughter. His voice thinner than she had ever heard it, his hands not quite as steady as they usually were. That night, after Ava was asleep, Marcus sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time before he made a single phone call. It lasted under a minute. He said only 2 words before hanging up. "It's time." On the other end of that call was a name from a life he had buried a long time ago, a contact who still had access to systems most people forgot existed, systems Marcus himself had once helped design during years he rarely allowed himself to think about anymore. 2 days later, an encrypted file arrived through a channel Marcus had not used in years, full access logs from the Kessler Estate's security network, the kind of data no outside investigator, and certainly no local police department, had thought to request through proper channels, buried too deep in bureaucracy to surface in time to matter. He began working through it alone, late at night, at the kitchen table, the same careful patience he brought to a knife or a whisk, now turned towards something far more dangerous. Line by line, hour by hour, until the house was silent, except for the soft click of keys and the occasional creak of the old floorboards settling around him. Meanwhile, the board's pressure had reached its peak. Vivian, cornered by shareholders demanding resolution before the rescheduled auction, signed the order to formally pursue prosecution against Marcus. She told herself it was necessary. She told herself the evidence, however circumstantial, pointed clearly enough in one direction to justify the decision she had already made publicly days earlier. But some nights, replaying the interrogation footage in her mind, long after everyone else had gone home, the house quiet around her in a way it rarely was, she found herself doubting the version of events she had built her entire decision upon. In the files Marcus reviewed, one detail surfaced again and again: the vault corridor's access credential, changed that night, belonged to a device registered under Preston Vaughn's personal security clearance, used at an hour Preston had claimed, in his official statement to police, to have been elsewhere on the property entirely, overseeing the ballroom setup with 2 witnesses who, on closer inspection, could only confirm his presence for part of that window, not all of it, as a gap of nearly 9 minutes neither witness could account for. It was not proof, not yet, but it was a thread. and Marcus had built an entire career out of pulling threads slowly enough that no one noticed until it was far too late to stop him from finishing what he had started. He arranged to meet Preston privately, under the pretense of returning a set of estate keys left behind after the rehearsal. The two men stood in the estate's empty wine cellar, low light catching the dust on old bottles that had not been disturbed in years. No witnesses, no cameras in that particular corner of the building, a fact Marcus suspected Preston already knew far too well. Marcus said little. He mentioned the access log almost in passing, mentioned the timing discrepancy the way a man might mention the weather, and watched Preston's composure crack for just a fraction of a second before he recovered it, a flicker so brief most people would have missed it entirely. But Marcus had spent a career learning to see exactly that kind of flicker. It was enough. Marcus did not need Preston to confess. He needed only to see the fear behind the recovery, the way a predator's eyes shift when it realizes, for the first time, that it might not be the only predator in the room. He left without another word, and the silence that followed him out of that cellar said more than any accusation could have, heavier than anything either man had spoken aloud, trailing him all the way up the stone steps and out into the night air. Preston stood alone among the bottles for a long while after Marcus had gone, replaying the conversation in his mind, searching for the moment he had given something away and finding, to his growing unease, that he could not pinpoint it exactly. That uncertainty frightened him more than a direct threat would have. A threat could be answered. A man who revealed nothing of his intentions while quietly dismantling yours could not be answered at all, only outrun. And Preston was no longer certain he had the time left to outrun anyone, or anywhere left in the estate quiet enough to think his way out of what was coming. Preston, rattled, began moving faster than he intended to. He fabricated additional evidence against Marcus, planting a false financial trail meant to suggest a debt, a motive, a reason for a struggling single father to risk everything for $4 million in diamonds he could never have sold without being caught within days. It was clumsy work, born of panic rather than precision, the first mistake a careful man makes when he starts to feel cornered by something he does not fully understand, working through the night to assemble documents that would not hold up under any real scrutiny. Vivian, reviewing a hallway camera feed unrelated to the case while searching for footage of a missing serving cart, caught a fragment of the wine cellar meeting by accident. Preston's rigid posture, Marcus's unreadable calm, the way the balance of power in that exchange did not match anything she had assumed about either man up to that point. She rewound the clip twice, watching it more carefully the second time, unable to shake the sense that she was seeing something she was not supposed to see. She said nothing to anyone. She simply began watching more carefully, no longer trusting the narrative she herself had helped build brick by brick over the past 2 weeks. The emergency board session was called for the following week, with detectives, company counsel, and shareholders present to review the case before Marcus's arraignment. The room packed tighter than any meeting Vivian could remember since her father's funeral, chairs pulled in from the hallway to fit everyone. Preston arrived with a folder of manufactured evidence, prepared to close the matter permanently, to bury Marcus so thoroughly that no one would think to look elsewhere. Not now, not ever. His voice already rehearsed to the point of sounding almost bored with its own certainty. He spoke first, laying out his fabricated timeline with practiced confidence, painting Marcus as a desperate man who had finally taken what he could not otherwise afford to give his daughter, a narrative built to appeal to exactly the kind of sympathy that made accusations easier to swallow. The room nodded along, ready to accept the tidy story being handed to them on a silver tray, eager for something simple after 2 weeks of chaos and falling stock prices. Marcus stood only when Preston finished speaking. He did not raise his voice. He laid out, calmly and in order, the access log discrepancy, the timing of the credential change, the gap in the wine cellar meeting Preston could not account for, and the financial trail that, upon closer inspection, had been assembled in under 72 hours, rather than accumulated over years, as any genuine debt trail would have shown under real scrutiny, the dates on the documents themselves betraying the rush in which they had been created. The room went quiet in a way it had not been quiet before, the kind of silence that had weight to it, that pressed against the walls and made even the air conditioning seem too loud. Vivian watched him from across the table, no longer seeing a suspect, but something closer to a man she did not yet understand, and was only beginning to, a man whose stillness suddenly made a great deal more sense than it had 2 weeks earlier. It was Preston who broke first, standing too fast, his chair scraping loud against the floor, insisting the evidence had been misinterpreted, that Marcus was manipulating the narrative to save himself, his voice climbing half an octave higher than it had been moments before, cracking at the edges in a way it never had before that room. Marcus let him talk. Then, in a voice that did not rise but somehow filled the entire room, reaching every corner of it without effort, he said the sentence that ended the argument before it truly began. "I spent my career finding men who believed money could buy the silence of the truth. You are not the first one I have taken down. You are only the most recent." The room did not move for several seconds, long enough that someone's phone buzzing in a pocket sounded almost violent against the silence. Somewhere in that silence, Vivian understood, with sudden and total clarity, exactly who she had dragged out of her own kitchen in handcuffs 2 weeks earlier, and exactly how badly she had misjudged him from the very first day he had walked through her door. The company's lead counsel, seated at the far end of the table, was the first to speak, asking Marcus in a careful, measured tone how, exactly, a private chef had come to possess this level of access, this depth of understanding about security infrastructure that had taken the firm's own consultants weeks to map. Marcus answered simply, without elaboration, that he had spent a decade in federal service before Savannah, before the apron, before any of it, and that some skills did not disappear simply because a man chose to stop using them publicly. He offered no further detail, and something in the way he said it made clear that none would be offered, not that day, not to that room. What followed came quickly once the truth had a foothold in the room. Marcus laid out the remaining evidence without theatrics, the recovered footage from the 11 missing minutes, quietly restored through the same channel that had sent him the original logs, showing Preston himself entering the vault corridor alone, moving with the ease of a man who knew exactly where every camera did and did not reach, a route he had clearly walked in his head 100 times before ever walking it in person. Financial records, obtained through that same network, traced a pattern of shell transactions running back 3 years, disguised as legitimate auction proceeds, funneling laundered money through counterfeit jewelry pieces, sold quietly alongside authentic Kessler and Vance inventory, to buyers who never asked too many questions and never needed to. The diamond theft had never been about the diamonds themselves. It had been cover, one loud crime designed to distract from a much quieter one that had been bleeding the company for years without anyone noticing, hidden in plain sight behind a man everyone in that room had trusted without question. Preston's face lost all color as the documents were passed around the table, hand to hand, silence deepening with every page turned. Security was called before he reached the door. As officers led him out through the same hallway where Marcus had once been paraded in handcuffs, he turned back once, and in a voice low enough that only a few caught it, he said this was only the surface, that there was more beneath it than any of them understood yet, a warning no one had time to follow up on. No one had time to ask what he meant. The doors closed behind him, and he was gone, the hallway falling into a silence entirely different from the one that had filled it 2 weeks before. Vivian sat in the silence that followed, the weight of what she had done finally settling over her in full, pressing down harder than any headline or shareholder call had managed to over the previous 2 weeks combined. She had humiliated a man in front of his colleagues, dragged him from his own kitchen in handcuffs, torn his name apart in public in front of people who would remember it for years, all while the real threat to her company had been standing at her side the entire time, murmuring poison into her ear, disguised as counsel she had trusted without question, since she was a child. She thought of her grandfather, of the store he had built with nothing but a jeweler's loop and a reputation for honesty, and wondered what he would have made of the past 2 weeks, and of a granddaughter so quick to condemn a man on the flimsiest of circumstantial threads, while the person feeding her those threads had been robbing the company blind for years. The thought sat heavy in her chest, heavier than she expected, and she did not try to push it away this time. She had built her entire identity around the idea that she led with judgment sharper than her father's, sharper than anyone's, and for the first time in her adult life, she was forced to sit with the possibility that her sharpest instincts had failed her exactly when they mattered most. She did not wait for the board to adjourn. She walked straight to Marcus, and in front of the same people who had watched her destroy him days earlier, She said the words plainly, without excuse or embellishment, her voice steadier than she expected it to be given how badly her hands were shaking beneath the table only moments before. She had been wrong. She had judged him by the shape of his job, rather than the substance of his character, and it had nearly cost her everything that mattered, including the one person who had quietly saved the company she had spent her whole life protecting without ever once asking for credit. Marcus accepted the apology, the way he accepted most things quietly, without drama, without immediate forgiveness either. Trust, once broken in public, did not rebuild itself with a single sentence, however sincere it sounded in the moment. He told her as much, plainly, without cruelty in his voice, and she did not argue the point, understanding it as clearly as anything she had understood in weeks. She had earned the distance he kept between them, and on some level, beneath the discomfort of it, she respected him more for holding that line than she would have if he had simply let it go. Kessler and Vance issued a public statement within days, correcting the record entirely, crediting Marcus by name for uncovering the fraud that had nearly collapsed the company from the inside out. His photograph, once splashed across headlines as a suspect in handcuffs, now appeared beside language like integrity and diligence, an irony not lost on anyone who had watched the story unfold from the very beginning, least of all Marcus himself, who read the article once at his kitchen table and set it aside without comment, unmoved by the same headlines that had once tried to end him. Federal investigators arrived within the week to take over the fraud case formally, and among the agents who walked through the estate gates was a man who recognized Marcus on sight, greeting him by a rank he had not held in years. The two spoke briefly, quietly, away from the cameras still lingering outside the property, and whatever passed between them stayed between them, though the older agent's parting handshake lingered a moment longer than a routine greeting required, the kind of gesture reserved for men who had once trusted each other with more than paperwork. In the weeks that followed, Vivian found small ways to close the distance she had created, never with grand gestures, but with consistency showing up, listening more than she spoke, giving Marcus the space to decide when, or if, he was ready to let her back in at all. One afternoon, she arrived to find Ava sitting on the porch steps after school, swinging her feet off the edge, and rather than retreating the way she once might have, she sat down beside her, asking about her day, listening without hurry, while Marcus watched from the doorway, saying nothing, but not looking away either. Something in his expression softer than it had been in weeks, softer than Vivian had ever seen it. It was a small moment, unremarkable to anyone passing by on the street, but it carried more weight than any apology could have carried on its own. Trust, Marcus had learned long ago in a different life entirely, was never rebuilt through words alone. It was rebuilt through the accumulation of moments exactly like that one, small and steady, and repeated, until they became something solid enough to stand on, brick by brick, the same way any real foundation was ever built, whether under a house or between two people. Ava, for her part, warmed to Vivian long before her father did, in the easy, uncomplicated way children sometimes manage what adults take months to work through. She began asking, on the drive home from school, whether Vivian might come by that evening, whether she liked board games, whether she had ever seen the fireflies that gathered along the back fence at dusk in late summer. Marcus watched the friendship take root without interference, careful never to push it in one direction or another, letting his daughter's instincts about people, sharper than anyone gave her credit for, run their own quiet course. By early autumn, the company had stabilized, the fraud fully unwound and reported to federal authorities, the auction rescheduled under tightened security that Marcus himself had quietly helped redesign, not as an employee this time, but as something closer to a partner whose expertise no one in the building questioned anymore, his name mentioned in meetings with a respect that had taken years to earn elsewhere, and had somehow arrived here in a matter of weeks. He never returned to the kitchen in the same role he had left it. He did not need to. The truth of who he had always been no longer required hiding behind an apron and a quiet smile, though he still wore both most mornings, simply because he wanted to. On the evening the new security systems went live, tested and approved after weeks of careful work, Vivian found him on the back terrace of the estate, looking out over the gardens as the sun dropped low behind the oaks, painting the whole yard in soft orange light that softened even the hardest edges of the house behind them. She stood beside him without a word, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them no longer heavy with suspicion, but with something else entirely, something neither of them was in any particular hurry to name aloud, content instead to simply stand there together and let the evening settle around them. Ava's laughter carried faintly from somewhere inside the house, chasing one of the estate's old dogs across the kitchen floor, bright and unguarded in a way it had not been in weeks, and both of them turned toward the sound at the same instant, smiling in a way that had nothing to do with diamonds, or fraud, or anything either of them had once believed about the other back when this had all begun on a night that already felt like a long time ago. Somewhere beyond the garden wall, the city of Savannah settled into its evening rhythm, unaware and unconcerned with the quiet reckoning that had just taken place behind one of its oldest gates, and a story already fading into the kind of history that only the people who lived it would ever fully understand. Neither of them had been looking.